right, good afternoon, everybody. Are we singing along to the Beatles?
Shut that up.
I didn't want to touch your stuff.
There we go.
Oh, all you got to do is unplug it. Yeah. Okay. All right, well, welcome to the Bay County Historical Museum. I'm Mike Batch-Kluper, I'm the director here, and welcome. And I hope you enjoy the cookies that are back there. I've been spending a lot of time putting them in plastic bags. No, I'm kidding. But we have a great speaker for you today. I have a quick question. How many have been to Second Saturdays before? Okay, raise your hand if you haven't been. So you're all here to see Gary Johnson, aren't you? Okay, there we go. All right, another question. How many had Gary Johnson as a teacher? Whoa! Was he any good? They're here, aren't they? Yeah, there we go. All right, well, welcome. Gary needs no introduction, so I'm just going to let it go from there. A couple of quick things. Next month's second Saturday, we're going to bring Rick Mixter back because in January he was snowed in where he lives down in Detroit, so he couldn't make it up, and we were all snowed in and we weren't going anywhere. So he's going to be talking about the Great Lakes shipwrecks, and it's a new program he's doing, so I would suggest be here because it's going to be good. And then in April we're not going to have a second Saturday because it's the Saturday before Easter, and you know everyone's hiding their Easter eggs that day. So anyways, give a big warm welcome to Mr. Gary Johnson.
Thank you, Mike. Well, tomorrow, Sunday, February the 9th, is the 56th anniversary of the Beatles' historic appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. Wow, 56 years. Time flies when you're having fun. So thank you for coming out to celebrate that event and also to celebrate the legacy of JFK. The commonly held belief regarding the relationship between John F. Kennedy and the Beatles is that America was in mourning following JFK's assassination in November of 1963. And the Beatles came on the scene in early 1964 and helped lift the veil of sadness that enveloped the country. There's a great deal of truth in that, but I believe that there is a lot more to the story, including some interesting Michigan connections. And I'm going to share them with you today. But first, let's look at some of the aspects of the Kennedy presidency that changed America, inspired young people, and contributed in some ways to the incredible success the Beatles enjoyed in this country. Kennedy used the emerging prominence of television in the late 1950s and early 1960s to promote his political stance and advance his policy initiatives both at home and abroad. His televised debates in the 1960 presidential campaign with then Vice President Richard Nixon were the first of their kind, and they changed the nature of politics in America. Without the televised debates, most historians feel that it would have been very likely that Kennedy would not have been elected. As a result, he can be considered the first TV president. And he ushered in the modern era in which presidential candidates absolutely must be effective television performers. It also didn't hurt that Kennedy was a certified war hero on the famed PT-109 patrol boat during the war in the Pacific. This fact was dramatized in the Hollywood film PT-109, released in June of 1963, and starred Cliff Robertson as JFK. It was the first commercial theatrical film about a sitting United States president released while he was still in office and still alive. Now, both Kennedy and Nixon campaigned in Michigan in the fall of 1960, but only Nixon came to Bay City. In this photo, he's shown driving down Center Avenue. He appeared at Bay City Central, and he and his wife dined at the Winona Hotel, where he reportedly ordered a cheeseburger. It was Kennedy who won 52% of the vote in Bay County in the 1960 election, however. Both candidates campaigned in Saginaw. Kennedy appeared at the Saginaw Fairgrounds on October the 14th, but Nixon drew twice as many for his campaign rally on Michigan Avenue on October 27th. Nixon won 56% of the vote in Saginaw County. In the general election, Kennedy won the popular vote over Nixon in Michigan by 66,000 votes. The state's 20 electoral votes helped JFK win the Electoral College 303 to 219. The popular vote across the nation was much closer, with JFK winning by a margin of just under 113,000 votes. So you can see how important that Michigan vote was. Kennedy was youthful, good-looking, quick-witted, and charming. His lovely wife, Jacqueline, became a fashion icon and took the nation on the very first televised First Lady tour of the White House in 1962. The press loved the Kennedys, and his presidency was compared by some to the fabled perfection of the Kingdom of Camelot of King Arthur legend. JFK was a very effective public speaker, and his inaugural address, which was the first to ever be delivered to a televised audience in color, is considered among the best presidential inaugural speeches in American history. Kennedy inspired many by supporting the movement for black equality, and by the spring of 1963 had come to see the struggle of African Americans as a moral one. In June of 1963, Kennedy called for the passage of a civil rights bill that would outlaw discrimination in public accommodations, strengthen voting rights, and enforce equal opportunity and employment for all. Although Kennedy's civil rights efforts were cut short by his assassination, Lyndon Johnson was able to push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Kennedy came up with the idea of the Peace Corps during an improvised campaign speech to a cheering crowd of 10,000 at the University of Michigan on October 14, 1960. After Kennedy was elected, the Peace Corps was officially established in 1961 by executive order. It was created with the goal of involving Americans more actively in the cause of global democracy, peace, development, and freedom. Since 1961, Michigan has supplied 7,518 volunteers to the organization, including 266 who are currently serving. JFK captured the imagination of the country in 1961 when he began a dramatic expansion of the U.S. space program. And he committed the nation to the ambitious goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Kennedy also reorganized a federal physical fitness program that had been a failure under President Eisenhower and developed a new council to oversee and market a new fitness program for Americans. During the 1961-62 school years, JFK developed a physical fitness pilot project or project for schools. We used the program in my PE classes at St. Joseph High School in Bay City. JFK's murder on November 22nd, 1963 may have been one of the most significant events that shaped modern history. One important aspect of this was the TV coverage of his assassination, especially the coverage by CBS. The tragic event ushered in the era of live television news. When CBS went on the air for 3 solid days of coverage, everyone realized for the first time the power of TV as a journalistic medium. Before that, newspapers and radio were the dominant forms of news. During the 1,000 days that Kennedy served as president, he appealed to young people in a way no other U.S. president ever had. And according to some schools of thought, when the Beatles came along, they tapped into the same youth market that Kennedy connected with. In that context, both Kennedy and the Beatles could be seen as attractive, refreshing alternatives to the status quo. Kennedy was to Richard Nixon in 1960, as the Beatles in 1964 were to Lawrence Welk. According to some scholars, what they both represented was very similar: a rejuvenation of American life and culture. They generated a feeling of optimism. Both made you feel that you could change things for the better. As stated earlier, the link between JFK's assassination and the Beatles' arrival in America involved the state of mourning the country had entered into following the death of the president. It helped make Americans, both young and old, experience the Beatles like a cathartic blast of joy. In February 1964, the Beatles were not just a band, they were a national antidepressant. The Beatles certainly deserve credit for helping to lift the country out of the numbing grief that enveloped it following JFK's assassination. Singer Tommy James grew up in Niles, Michigan, where he formed the Shondells. His band would go on to record Hanky Panky at a local radio station, and it would go on to become the first Michigan garage rock single to reach #1 on Billboard's Hot 100 in 1966. Tommy James recalled the time in a recent interview when he said, "After JFK's assassination, the Beatles were the only thing that made 1964 bearable." Although true, these accounts overlook the earlier connection between the Beatles and America that occurred while JFK was still alive, some of which involved Michigan. The very first Beatles record to be released in the U.S. was Please Please Me. It was the Beatles' first big hit in England, reaching #2 on the Parlophone label in January of 1963, but its American label, Capitol Records, declined to issue it in the United States. As a result, the song was placed with VJ Records, who signed a licensing agreement and released it in the U.S. in February of 1963, 9 months before JFK's assassination. This very first Beatles record to be sold in America was manufactured at the American Record Pressing Plant located in, of all places, Owasso, Michigan. The record did not chart in the U.S., but the 45 that was pressed there is a collector's item because a mistake was made on the spelling of the group's name. Beatles with 2 T's. The Beatles' third single in England, From Me to You, was their first #1 hit in that country. The song also became the first song written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney to chart in the Billboard Hot 100 in the US when it was covered by Michigan's Del Shannon in the summer of 1963, and it reached number 73. VJ Records out of Chicago was one of American Record Pressing's main clients, and the Owasso plant also pressed the Beatles' original version of From Me to You on VJ in 1963. Now, after Del Shannon's cover version charted, VJ placed ads in music trade papers that called the Beatles version the original hit. This resulted in the song getting enough radio play to reach number 116 on the Billboard chart and making American Record Pressing the company that also pressed the first record by the Beatles to chart in America. Capitol Records had also passed on the first Beatles album that had been released in England in 1963. VJ Records acquired the rights, which became very valuable after the Beatles broke big in early 1964. Introducing the Beatles, which was also pressed in Owasso, became the first Beatles album to be released in the US in January of 1964, and it sold 1.3 million copies. VJ and its Tolly subsidiary label released a number of songs from the album as Beatles singles in 1964. These were also pressed in Owasso and included the top 10 hits, Please Please Me, Twist and Shout, Do You Want to Know a Secret, and Love Me Do. VJ's licensing agreement ended in late 1964, and American Record Pressing no longer manufactured Beatles recordings from that point on. But American Record Pressing also had the distinction of pressing the very first Motown 45, Come to Me, by Marv Johnson on the Tamla label. Berry Gordy Jr. and Smokey Robinson actually drove to Owasso from Detroit in the winter of 1959 to pick up the first boxes of the singles. Now, I don't know how well you can see this if you're in the back, but notice the address under the Tamla label. Gordy had just borrowed $800 from his family to start his label, and he was operating his business from his apartment, very tiny apartment on Gladstone Street in Detroit at that time, and that's why it's on the record label. During the 1960s, Motown grew and became American Record Pressing company's most important customer, representing about 80% of its business. After Motown had moved its operation to California in 1972, the American Record Pressing plant burned down under very suspicious circumstances. Now, most Americans think that the first glimpse of the Beatles on television in this country was either on the Jack Parr program or the Ed Sullivan Show in early 1964. But in what can only be described as a very eerie coincidence, the very first appearance by the Beatles on American TV was on the CBS Morning News, hosted by Mike Wallace, on November 22nd, 1963, the very same day that JFK was assassinated. The Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, had been lobbying television networks to do a story on the band as the word Beatlemania began spreading across British newspapers. Alexander Kendrick, the CBS London correspondent, decided to take a look, and he filed a report on the phenomena that included some live performance footage of the band along with a backstage interview with the Beatles. Kendrick's story from what he called Beatle Land included the band playing their latest hit, She Loves You, in the British seaside resort of Bournemouth. Panning the crowd, CBS cameras captured the screaming teens in what Kendrick described as an epidemic that had seized the population, especially females. Backstage, the Beatles were philosophical about their rising fame. When asked if they feared that their fans would tire and move on, George Harrison replied, "It's not worth missing your sleepover, is it?" Yeah, a lot of the early coverage of the Beatles was pretty condescending, just like that one. Now, the piece debuted on the CBS Morning News with Mike Wallace, as I said earlier, on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. Of course, kids were getting ready for school when it was on, or people were getting ready for work. So probably very few people saw this. And even if they did, really, hardly anybody knew who the Beatles were at that particular time. It was slated to run again that night on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, but it was preempted by the assassination of President Kennedy. Weeks later, on December 10th, Walter Cronkite aired Kendrick's report on the Beatles. Ed Sullivan watched the broadcast and called Cronkite immediately after the program, setting in motion what was to become the Beatles' historic appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964. Sullivan was beaten to the punch, however, by Jack Parr on his Friday night primetime NBC show, The Jack Parr Program. Parr had seen the Beatles in the fall of 1963 on British television and had purchased some concert footage of the group from the BBC. He featured it on his TV show on January 4th, 1964, a month before the Beatles were scheduled to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show, infuriating Ed Sullivan in the process. I Want to Hold Your Hand had just been released in America on December the 26th, and the song was all over the radio when Parr's program aired. Now, I was at a house party, with my fellow seniors from St. Joseph High, and I remember that the party stopped and everyone crowded around the black and white television set to get their first look at the Beatles. Now, although Jack Parr poked fun at the band and their fans, I mean, everyone at the party knew we were seeing something special. 4 weeks later, with I Want to Hold Your Hand topping the charts, the Beatles arrived at the JFK airport on Friday, February the 7th, to thousands of screaming fans. And then to a crowded news conference in the Pan Am Lounge with 200 hard-boiled reporters. The reporters had been waiting for hours and were grumbling about their lousy assignment. What they got instead was an hour-long collection of witty quips, clever comebacks, and improvised comedy routines that made for great copy. Like John F. Kennedy, the Beatles were very quick-witted and had an innate ability to charm an audience. The Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time on Sunday, February 9th. The program was watched by an all-time record audience of 73 million. The show remains a landmark in television history, perhaps the single most notable moment in the history of rock and roll, and an indelible memory for all of us who watched the historic performance. There was a big Michigan connection on that Ed Sullivan Show. Terry McDermott, the Essexville Rocket, had won the Olympic gold medal in the 500-meter speed skating event at the 1964 Winter Olympics in Innsbruck, Austria. And he was introduced in the audience by Sullivan following the Beatles' first set. McDermott and his wife Virginia had never heard of the Beatles, but were invited backstage to meet them before the show. McDermott said that they chatted for 15 to 20 minutes, and he recalled that the Beatles were very polite and insisted on calling them Mr. and Mrs. McDermott, despite the fact they were all about the same age. They then posed for some gag photos, since McDermott had worked at Bunny's Barbershop on Columbus Avenue in Bay City before achieving Olympic glory. The Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show for 3 consecutive weeks, and in the process became the world's first television band, much in the way that JFK had become the first television president. They also kicked off what became known as the British Invasion and helped introduce a host of British bands, including the Animals, the Dave Clark Five, the Kinks, and the Rolling Stones, to American audiences. The incredible success of the Beatles on TV also inspired ABC to start a primetime pop music show called Shindig, and NBC to produce one called Hullabaloo. Although they were not directly involved in the civil rights movement, the Beatles were big fans of American rhythm and blues music, and especially Motown and its roster of artists. The Beatles visited Hitsville, USA during one of their concerts in Detroit, and the Beatles' second album contained covers of Motown hits by the Marvelettes, the Miracles, and Barrett Strong. Earning the seal of approval from the Beatles was an important factor in helping Motown achieve its breakout year in 1964, when it became both a national and international success. The Beatles were also the first rock and roll artists to star in a feature film playing themselves. The musical comedy was filmed in a mock documentary style at the height of Beatlemania in 1964. A Hard Day's Night is credited as being one of the most influential of all musical films, inspiring the Monkees TV series and a number of other film comedies and pop music videos in the late 60s and beyond. In much the same way that Jacqueline Kennedy started fashion trends for females, the Beatles brought about some fashion changes in America for males. These included collarless jackets and Beatle boots. But the most significant fashion change involved hair length. The crew cut ruled before the Beatles, or men wore their hair combed back. The Beatles' early do's were much longer, combed down over their foreheads, but barely touching their ears. But change is sometimes difficult, and this new style in boys' hair was not immediately accepted in Michigan. Bay City's public schools had a strict grooming code, and the start of the school year in September of 1965 at Bay City Central was clouded in controversy. Senior John Hale and sophomore Tom Smith were singled out for coming to school with hair lengths that were considered in violation. The boys and their mothers argued that it was a matter of civil liberty. They were members of a teenage rock and roll band called the Epics, and the hairstyles pictured here were part of their image. The Bay City Times printed several stories about the controversy in the fall of 1965. Central's principal stated that an improved teaching situation would prevail if students attending senior high were dressed and groomed in a manner appropriate to conventional business attire. Now, guess who won that showdown? Right. Both boys did not back down, but they ended up being expelled for the entire 1965-66 school year. Certainly was not a shining moment for public education at Bay City Central or in Bay City as a whole. This public debate over long hair on males was one that raged all across the country in the late 1960s. In all, over 100 cases were appealed to the federal courts in the United States, and 9 were appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, which sidestepped the issue again and again. One case appealed to the Supreme Court involved 3 members of a Texas band who were suspended from school because of their Beatles-styled haircuts. The boys lost at the appeals level, and when the Supreme Court refused to hear the case, the earlier decision stood. Lastly, the Beatles also helped make the USA a guitar nation. They changed the cultural perception of what a band was and inspired countless groups of young people like John Hale and Tom Smith to pick up guitars and form bands in basements and garages in Michigan and all over the country. The Byrds was a highly successful band from California and one of many young groups that were initially inspired by the sound, the harmonies, and the look of the Beatles. They had a #1 hit in 1965 with their folk rock version of Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man. And the group performed it at Band Canyon in Bay City in July of 1965 on their first U.S. tour. Prior to joining the Byrds, guitarist Jim McGuinn was a folk singer, and he wrote new words to the traditional folk song, "He Was a Friend of Mine," to lament the death of President Kennedy. McGuinn's words, which were written on the night of November 22nd, 1963, contained the lyrics, "Though I never met him, I knew him just the same. He was a friend of mine." Kennedy's charisma was such that young people like McGuinn thought of him as a friend. The Beatles appealed to the nation's youth in much the same way. The Byrds didn't record McGuinn's song until the fall of 1965 for inclusion on their second album, which was titled Turn, Turn, Turn. The band appeared at Daniel's Den in Saginaw on December 5th, the day before their new album was to be released. Now, by that time, He Was a Friend of Mine had already become a regular part of the Byrds' set list, and they performed the song at Daniel's Den. It was probably the first time anyone in Michigan had heard their tribute to JFK. Thank you very much for coming today. I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it.